So this is a presentation about a book that I am working on right now. Actually, I just sent the finished proposal out yesterday is when I did that. And I don't think anyone will get it for a while because, you know, it's Christmas. This is small talk while I figure out how to get this going. Okay, so it is a book, something, how the Book of Mormon reads the Bible. And it's about how the Book of Mormon reads the Bible. And that probably elicits a question, at least it does when I hear something like that. The question goes, what do you mean, how does the Book of Mormon read the Bible? Books don't read, people do. Sheesh. In other words, it sort of sounds strange to have books reading each other. So I want to talk about what I mean by this. And this is a project that began 5 years ago now, when I read the Book of Mormon and blogged every week about what I saw there after not having read it for quite some time. And what I saw just really kept coming back to biblical typology and type scenes. And that's because of what's called dissertation myopia. I wrote my dissertation on biblical typology and type scenes in the 18th century, and I wrote another book about that in 2010. So it's just always on my mind. So let's talk about what do I mean, how does the Book of Mormon read the Bible? Is somebody dinging? Okay. The project uses two background concepts, and they're deep background. I'm not planning on articulating them or going through them or making the arguments, but there are two ways of looking at texts, one that comes from literature and one that comes from theology, that I want to import into this project. And the concept from narrative theory from American Fork, Utah native Wayne Booth, who taught at the University of Chicago for a long time. He talked a lot about the implied author in his book, The Rhetoric of Fiction. And that's the authorial voice in the text that is separate from any other character or narrator, but isn't quite the actual same person as the author. It's the implied author that when you're the reader, you're interacting with this implied author. Canonical criticism, that's a term that we don't look at a lot in our version of seminary, but most of my friends who go to the other kind of seminary, which are usually Catholic and take 4 years to get through and you get a degree at the end, but actual seminary, one of the things they study is a fellow named Reverend Childs, who back in the 1970s wrote a book called Crisis in Biblical Interpretation, I think. And he argued that when you're looking at the Bible in a seminary, from a perspective of belief, the most important form is the final form that the scripture takes for the community of people who believe in it. That means that you've got alternate contexts and you've got multiple authors and you've got a lot of things that are in dispute and people don't agree on everything, but there is this final form of the scriptures. And for Christians, it's the Old Testament and the New Testament together. And that final form, the form that was meaningful for the people who have believed this for the last 1,500 years, is, if you're in a believing context, the most appropriate version of the text to use. And what that allows you to do, and what I'm quite frankly doing because I just don't have the time or the knowledge to do it all, is just eluding a whole lot of questions about who wrote what when, and what language they wrote it in, and what original text there are, and what alternate texts there are. And that's common in the Bible in the seminaries. I think it's almost inevitable when we're talking about the Book of Mormon, where almost everything is disputed. If you are or are not a believer, the Book of Mormon is an ancient record, or it's a modern novel, and it has one author, or it has 15 authors and an editor, and it was for believers, written in a language that may or may not exist and that nobody knows anything about. So I didn't want to write sentences like this. And this is why I'm talking about books reading each other. How does the sermon of Abinadi's, recorded in the record of Zenith with the editorial insertions of Mormon 500 years later, as translated in ways we are not quite sure about by Joseph Smith more than 1,000 years after that, and who may or may not have been a fictional character, interpret the prophecies of the biblical Isaiah, who was probably 2 or even 3 different people, and this passage comes from the presumed second Isaiah, and whose prophecies are reworked during the Babylonian captivity to support a Deuteronomistic view of history in order to explain the captivity, but which were reinterpreted in the Christian era as anticipatory types of Christ, which they may or may not have been to begin with, depending on your perspective. It was just easier to say, how does the Book of Mormon read the Bible? But that's what I'm asking, is how does whoever wrote the Book of Mormon, whoever wrote the passage, we have this final form, we have this canonical text, and it is a text that is deeply involved with the Bible and the Christian Bible, both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I find that significant, and that's what I want to talk about. So, how does the Book of Mormon read the Christian Bible? And this is the subject of the book. And notice I put the word Christian in here because it makes a difference. There are many different Bibles, but the Bible can also mean just what Christians call the Old Testament, and that is actually very important to the argument that I'm trying to make. And I actually have two different analogs to how the Book of Mormon reads the Bible. One of the analogs is the book The Aeneid by Virgil, and the other is the way that the New Testament reads the Hebrew Bible. And what we're going to talk about now is typology, which is the subject. It has been my major focus for the last 20 years with the Bible and with some of the novels of the 17th and 18th century, how they use this feature called typology. And there are, in the literature, in the scholarly literature, there are really 2 different huge fonts of theory and criticism about reading things typologically. One comes from the classical studies of the 20th century. A man named Walter Arendt wrote a book in German called something like the Tippen, Schnicken, Schnicken, Schniegens de Homer, the type scenes of Homer. And he's talking about type scenes and typology as a way that oral narrative makes the transition into written narrative. There are certain cues. And then there is the canonical type of typological reading. And this is the type of reading that gets us the Old Testament, because there's only an Old Testament in relationship to a New Testament. And the argument of the Old Testament, if you are pairing it canonically with the New Testament, is that the New Testament fulfills the types, the anticipatory symbols of the Old Testament, and that they work together. And if you read the Old Testament canonically, which is how Reverend Child said we need to read it, that means you're reading it as part of a book that joined another book and then became one canon. And so I want to talk about these 2 analogs, one that comes from classical studies and one that comes from biblical studies, of how to read typologically. And let's start with the Aeneid. I would normally be asking questions about this, but I'm just going to sort of lecture, and then we'll talk about the we'll do questions and answers later. But the Aeneid is the great founding epic of Rome. It's the story of Aeneas, and Aeneas was a Trojan. He was actually the son of the goddess, well, Aphrodite, except that was Venus in the Roman mythologies. And let's a little bit about the context. Why was the Aeneid written? The Aeneid was written in the reign of Augustus Caesar, so the very beginning of the Roman Empire, after Caesar destroyed the Roman Republic. And at that time, most of the mythology, the gods and goddesses that the Romans worshipped were Greek, because the Romans, even though they conquered Greece militarily, Greece conquered Rome culturally. So all of a sudden, all of the Romans are now believing in a Greek religion and Greek gods, And this worked against Augustus's plans because Augustus wanted to make Rome great again. I mean, he was a nationalist. He was trying to build an empire. And so his court propagandists, one of whom was Virgil, and he was a very good writer, but he was dependent on Augustus. They had to shape the Greek myths in a way that made them more Roman. Because otherwise, why is Greek culture based, or why is Roman culture based on this foreign religion? So Virgil tells the story of Aeneas. Aeneas was a Trojan. He was spared from the destruction of Troy by a dream that led him out of the city right before it was destroyed. And he built ships and he sailed from Troy to Latium. There should be an I there, Latium. And for the first half of the Aeneid, it reads a lot like the Odyssey. Odysseus going from place to place, having adventures. He even meets most of the monsters that Odysseus meets. And then when he gets to Latium, the second half of the book, he has to have great epic battles and sieges in order to establish the empire, which is a lot like the Iliad. So what this does is it gave the Romans a reason to have Greek mythology as the basis of their religious system by inserting the Romans back into the story. And as a result, the Romans believed these gods all along because the Romans are Trojans and they're just as good as the Greeks. And actually, we're going to see they're even better. But the way that Aeneas made these connections was through these things that Walter Arendt identified called type scenes, or little bits of narrative that are structured the same way in both stories. Let me just give you one example. This is the Scylla and Charybdis scene in Homer. And pretend that we're in a classroom and I'm asking you how many of you have ever heard of Scylla and Charybdis. It's one of the most misused metaphors in our culture because people think that it means you have to sail through Scylla and Charybdis and you have to avoid the monster because Scylla is a six-headed monster that's on the rocks, and Charybdis is a sea monster that sucks everything in. And you can't sail between Scylla and Charybdis. You have to choose, and you have to choose Scylla, which means you just have to let 6 of your men die. So here is Armand de Sante's Odysseus in a miniseries about 20 years ago. And I just want to play a little clip of the scene of Scylla and Charybdis. I think this does a good job of capturing it. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, so we're going from here in Butrint to Rome through the Straits of Messina, right next to the shoe of Kenny Loggins, I think. I hope you were laughing your heads off of that, but you're just on mute. And that is the route that you go to get to Italy through Scylla and Charybdis, through the Straits of Messina. When Aeneid meets Helenus, he says, don't even try it. It's not worth it. Go around Sicily. So this is a route that Aeneas took. So there really isn't a Scylla and Charybdis scene because because Aeneas took, and I actually did this on a map. It's 200 extra miles, and it takes about 6 extra days to go this way. But Aeneas was patient and had foresight, and he didn't do stupid things. So this is something that shows 2 different facets of typology. The connective and the corrective sense of typology. Connectively, the type scenes between the Aeneas and the Odyssey show that that the Romans were all part of the same mythical context or sacred history as the Greeks were. The corrective typology says Ulysses got it wrong. He didn't have to go through the Straits of Messina. If he'd have been a good Roman, patient, industrious, thoughtful, and a good planner, he would have just gone around. And that whole nonsense about how he had to do this just shows how impetuous the Greeks are. So the type scenes are at once connective and corrective. Now, I want you to think about this in the Book of Mormon context, because the Book of Mormon is actually doing something very similar to what the Aeneid was doing, in that Americans in the Jacksonian age in the 1820s and 1830s were largely, almost all Christian, but Christianity came from a foreign country. It came from Europe. It came from a land that they had no part of. So the Book of Mormon is, in some ways, inserting America, the American nation, into sacred history and saying that it's been there all along. And the Native Americans, well, they're actually Lamanites, much the same way that the Romans are actually Trojans. So you have this sense of creating a narrative that inserts a new group of people, a new land, a new place, a new culture into sacred history. So that's why I'm using the Aeneid as a type scene here, because the uses of typology are very similar. And then there's biblical typology. And this is what we're much more familiar with, unless we are classicists. Biblical typology is the way that Christians have always, from the very beginning, read the Jewish Bible or the Hebrew Bible. They read it as a series of types. If you read Matthew is probably the most typological of all of the gospel writers. He is constantly telling us this happened so that this prophecy of the Old Testament could be fulfilled. This happened so this thing of the Old Testament could be fulfilled. And what Matthew was trying to show is that that Christos, is actually the Messiah, both of which are simply the same word, simply translations of the same word, that the Old Testament is really all about the Messiah, and that's Christ. So the Old Testament is really all about Jesus Christ, except it just never says it like that. You have to be able to read the types. And types are very, very interesting. They're kind of like symbols, except they work in reverse. A type is a symbol of something that hasn't happened yet. So what you really have in typology, the whole discourse of typology, which really is more or less in place by about the end of the 5th century AD. This is Gregory the Great. He wrote a book on Job, Morals in Job. It was about 600,000 words. So that's 10 times longer than my book on Job. But it lays out the foundations for reading everything in the Old Testament typologically. So Moses is a type of Christ because he leads people out of sin and into salvation. Jonah is a type of Christ because he spends 3 days in the whale's belly and then he is resurrected. Abraham is a type of Christ because Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac, the Akedah, is a symbol, an anticipatory symbol of God's sacrifice of his only begotten son. And beneath this understanding of typology lies an understanding of history, that history is not a stream of cause and effect. History, the main relationship in history is between prophecy and fulfillment of prophecy. So there are simply different ideas in the fabric of reality that recur consistently in history. And that is why everything that happened in the Old Testament is absolutely 100% true itself and is also an anticipatory symbol of Jesus Christ. Without this, you can't have an Old Testament and a New Testament, because the Old Testament is only the Old Testament because it testifies to the same thing that the New Testament testifies to, which is the divinity of Jesus Christ, the messiahship of Christ. And this, for 1,500 years at least, the discourse of typology has emerged as the primary way that Christians read the Old Testament and the New Testament as part of the same canon. Just one more example, and this is a type scene in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that is the scene in Exodus where the Pharaoh decides to massacre all of the Hebrew children, and the scene in our nativity scene when Herod decides to massacre all of the Jewish children. So this massacre of the innocents type scene recurs in ways that are unmistakable. That and this is not a modern invention. Josephus mentions this, and he was a contemporary almost of the times. That this is the way that people at the time saw it. Christ is the new Moses, and because Christ is the new Moses, here we have these type scenes that they participate in together, because they are different parts taking part of the same fabric of reality. So behind both the classical and the biblical understanding of typology and type scenes is the idea that narratives are built out of building blocks, little pieces of story that can be reassembled in different ways to produce different narratives. For example, a young hero is called to adventure by the search for his heroic father. Is that Hamlet? Is that the Odyssey? Is that the Iranian epic Sohrab and Rostam? Or is that Star Wars? And the answer is, it is all of them. That is a type. And it's such a universal type that it takes on a new name. It is an archetype. And that means a big overall super duper type. Because so many stories are built on this archetype. A young woman must save her community from spiritual pollution and physical disaster. Is that Antigone? Is that Esther? Is that Scheherazade? Or is that Wonder Woman? The answer, of course, is it's all four of them, because this is an archetype. And archetypes are the deep meanings of stories. And the work of Joseph Campbell, the work of Carl Jung, the work of Mircea Eliade, and a number of other myth collectors has been to look at these stories, to drag these pieces of stories and reassemble them in different ways and show the connections of these big archetypes. So I want to talk about, just to close, I want to talk about some structural archetypes in both the Book of Mormon and the Bible. And if I have done this correctly, the following 7 things should apply to both books equally. So as you listen to these are like young boy in search of father has adventures narratives that are equally applicable to the Book of Mormon and to the Bible. First, the entire narrative is framed as the story of the descendants of a single family that had a unique relationship to God. The original ancestor is a righteous patriarch with a younger son who becomes his spiritual heir, despite the efforts of his jealous older brothers who try to take his life. Right? That's Lehi and Nephi and Laman and Lemuel and Sam, but it's also Jacob and Joseph and his brothers who throw him in a pit, etc. With the help of the Lord, a group of people are led out of a great city, delivered from bondage, and required to wander for a time in the wilderness until they are spiritually prepared to enter the promised land. This is one type that's been explored a lot by LDS scholars, the Exodus type, because there's a great deal. There are actually 7 little mini Exodus scenes throughout the Book of Mormon that show that the Book of Mormon people are partaking of the same Exodus typology that the people in the Bible partake of. 3, after they inherit the promised land, the chosen people break into 2 separate units, each of which traces its origins back to the original family. In each case, one of the 2 societies is completely destroyed, while the other becomes a saving remnant that will perpetuate the unique relationship to God. So this is Nephites and Lamanites, but it's also the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. Some of the most important parts of the narrative consist of the warnings of prophets who speak in a voice of warning to the people. Take out that word represent, it shouldn't be there. 5, about 3/4 of the way through the text, the story is permanently and drastically changed by the appearance of Jesus Christ. 6, the later part of the narrative is largely structured by missionary journeys of an unbeliever who is converted to Christ by a heavenly visitor, Paul and Alma the Younger. And if you haven't noticed the similarity of those stories, you haven't been paying attention, because they're very, very similar. And finally, the narrative ends with a cataclysmic event that fundamentally alters the society that it depicts. So those are the connective types that I'm looking at. Each of those roughly, not exactly, but each of those is a chapter in the book that I'm working on. There is a corrective nature to each of these archetypes. And let's talk about that. The narrative is framed as the descendant of a single family, but the Abrahamic covenant in the Bible is presented primarily as a collective agreement between God and the nations of Israel, who were rewarded and punished to the extent that the entire society observes the law. In the Book of Mormon, the individual's covenant with God is usually primary, and personal righteousness is almost always presented as more important than lineage. Exodus. The Exodus narrative has three parts to it. It is, you leave a city that's about to be destroyed, you wander around in the wilderness, and then you commit genocide and cleanse the land and take it over. So there is Exodus, wandering, and conquest. In the Book of Mormon, we don't have conquest. We don't have the Exodus. The people go to a land that is at least presented to us as empty, or they go into a city and everybody shouts for joy. Hooray, hooray, the Nephites are here, our lost cousins, let's make them the king. So you have all of the aspects of the Exodus typology in great detail, but you don't have conquest and colonization. And these are significant, I'm going to argue, very significant theological differences between the types. After they inherit the promised land, the chosen people break into two groups. But in the Bible, the Israelites who remain after Israel is destroyed are the ones that create the final form of the Hebrew Bible for their own community. In the Book of Mormon, it's the destroyed people who create the final form of the text for the people who destroyed them. That's an interesting switch. Prophets, there are prophets in both the Old Testament and in the Book of Mormon, but there's a huge difference in the prophets. Most of the prophets in the Bible are sort of old, scraggly outsiders who eat locusts and don't bathe, and they come into town and they deliver their message and then they leave. And there are two prophets who act like that in the Book of Mormon, and those are Abinadi and Samuel the Lamanite, who are very much Old Testament prophets. But almost everyone else who's described as a prophet is an institutional authority. King Benjamin and King Noah, high priests, generals, Helaman and Mormon, Moroni, chief judges, Alma the Younger, Helaman the Younger. So prophets in the Book of Mormon are presidents of stuff. Prophets in the Bible are not presidents of stuff. They're ultimate outsiders. Whereas in the Book of Mormon, prophets are ultimate insiders. There is a theological importance to that distinction for Latter-day Saint contemporary practice. Jesus Christ appears about the same place in both stories. However, the Jesus of the New Testament is a mortal teacher who is despised by the religion of his community and executed by the state. The Jesus of the Book of Mormon is this resurrected, immensely powerful deity who trashes the whole country, and when he comes, everyone bows down. It's very different representation, even though their words are the same, even though Christ's words are the same in both the Book of Mormon and the Bible, almost verbatim. The context is radically different. Conversion. And this is the first thing I started thinking about. This is the one that led me to this whole project. Saul is a very faithful Jew who does not believe in Christ, and he persecutes Christians because he believes that's what God wants him to do. Alma the Younger is the son of the high priest and the chief judge who persecutes Christians because he's a rebellious kid. Paul has to experience a conversion of the intellect. He has to find out and discover something. Alma the Younger has to change his behavior. So conversion for Paul is changing his belief structure. Conversion for Alma is changing his behavior because he already actually knows what is true. And if you go through the book of Acts and the book of Alma, almost all of the conversions in Acts are the former kind. And with the exception of King Lamoni and some of the Lamanite narratives, almost all of the conversions in the book of Alma are with the dissident Nephites who know perfectly well what the truth is. They're just bad and they don't want to do it. So conversion gets redefined from a change in belief to change in behavior. And I think that's really significant. And finally, apocalypse. Both events end with an apocalyptic great battle, but the cataclysm that ends the Bible is prophecy, and the cataclysm that ends the Book of Mormon is history. Again, there's a fundamental difference in the typology, even though there's also a fundamental sameness. So the 7 big archetypes that I want to be looking at here, covenant, exodus, salvation, prophets, Jesus Christ, conversion, and apocalypse, are some of the most important concepts that a theology can have. And what we get is this very, very fascinating and intricate connection with correction between the Book of Mormon and the Bible. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.